This
is my property.
In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the lawns were clipped to perfection and driveways sparkled under the weekend sun, the unwritten rules of neighborly peace balanced on thin lines. Most residents respected those boundaries, literal and figurative, but some saw them as obstacles to be ignored. One such person was the woman who would soon become the center of a bitter feud, the kind of dispute that would ripple far beyond the neighborhood itself. For months, the narrator, a homeowner, who valued peace and privacy, had worked hard to maintain his property. His backyard fence wasn't extravagant or flashy. It was simply a wooden boundary that marked what was his and what was not. It had been there for years, standing as a quiet sentinel of order. But to his neighbor, a woman the entire neighborhood knew as that type of person, it was nothing more than an inconvenience. She was the kind of neighbor who believed rules were for everyone else, the kind who cut corners when it suited her and lashed out when anyone dared to challenge her behavior. It started subtly. At first, there were footprints in the flower bed, near the fence. The grass by the corner of the yard seemed more trampled than usual. But it wasn't until one spring morning, when the narrator noticed a jagged hole in the wooden panels, that the truth revealed itself. The fence had been broken, not by accident, not by weather, but by force. The splintered wood and uneven edges showed signs of deliberate destruction. What had happened was simple, but outrageous. The neighbor, let's call her Karen, had decided that walking around the block to reach the main road was too much of an inconvenience. Instead of following the sidewalks like everyone else, she smashed through the fence to carve herself a shortcut. What should have been a peaceful boundary had become a makeshift pathway, and Karen, without hesitation, strutted through it as though it had always been her right. The narrator was stunned. The nerve of someone not only to destroy private property, but to use it openly, as if nothing was wrong. It was beyond anything he had imagined. At first, he tried to approach the situation with patience. He repaired the fence. New panels, freshly nailed, stood where the hole had been. For a day or two, the shortcut vanished, but the peace didn't last. Within the week, the fence was broken again, this time with an even wider gap. Karen didn't even bother to be subtle. She used the opening daily, striding through the backyard without a hint of shame. The neighbors began to whisper. Everyone saw her cutting across the property, but no one dared to confront her. This was not the first time Karen had clashed with others in the neighborhood. She had a reputation for explosive tantrums and shameless entitlement. People avoided conflict with her the way one might avoid stepping on a rattlesnake. But the narrator, watching his fence fall apart again and again, knew he couldn't stay silent forever. Fixing the fence was becoming expensive. The wood, the labor, the time, all wasted, only to be destroyed within days. He considered calling the authorities, but he hesitated. The fear of escalating matters loomed large. After all, Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was confrontational. She thrived on conflict, and anyone who challenged her ended up regretting it. Still, there comes a point when patience runs dry. Each crack of wood in the middle of the night, each morning that revealed another deliberate act of vandalism, hardened his resolve. If Karen wanted a war over a fence, then so be it. But what she didn't realize was that this homeowner wasn't going to fight on her terms. Instead of meeting anger with anger, he decided on a path far more devastating, a legal, calculated strike that would trap her in her own arrogance. The research began quietly. Property maps, boundary lines, and land records became his nightly reading material. He discovered something fascinating. The very strip of land Karen was so desperate to cross wasn't entirely hers to begin with. A narrow sliver along the boundary was still technically available for purchase, overlooked in a subdivision adjustment years earlier. It wasn't much, just a few feet wide, but it was strategically placed. If he acquired it, he wouldn't just rebuild his fence. He would control the very shortcut Karen had claimed as her own. The idea took root and grew stronger each day. He wasn't just going to repair what Karen broke. He was going to buy the ground beneath her shortcut and turn her reckless defiance into a prison of her own making. But before any of that could happen, he had to endure the ongoing storm. Karen grew bolder as the weeks passed. Sometimes she walked, through with shopping bags, other times with her dog straining on a leash. Each time she acted as though the fence and the property it stood on didn't exist. Each time, the narrator's frustration built, but so did his determination. This wasn't just about wood and nails anymore. This was about respect, about property rights, and about making sure Karen finally learned that her arrogance had consequences. The day he contacted the county office, it felt like the first decisive step in reclaiming not just his yard, but his dignity. While Karen paraded through his property, oblivious to what was coming, the gears of something much larger were quietly turning in his favor. The paperwork would take time, the legal transfer of land even longer, but he was patient. Karen thought she was winning by smashing fences. She had no idea she was about to lose something far more important. By the end of that summer, the stage was set. The land purchase was in motion, the fence plans were ready, and all that remained was timing. Karen still strutted through the gap in the fence daily, as though mocking her neighbor's helplessness. She didn't realize that every step she took was on ground that would soon belong entirely to the person she thought she was defeating. And when that day came, when the ink dried on the papers and the fence went back up, Karen wouldn't just lose her shortcut. She would be trapped in a cage of her own making, with no way to escape but through the very rules she had ignored all along. The battle had started with broken wood, but it was about to end with something far stronger. Ironclad. Property rights. The fence was no longer just a piece of wood hammered into the soil. It had become the symbol of a battle line drawn between a homeowner determined to defend what was his and a neighbor who treated boundaries as meaningless inconveniences. Karen, strutting through the gap she had torn, believed she had won. To her, the broken wood meant she had the upper hand. What she did not know was that behind the scenes, her so-called victory was already slipping away. The process of acquiring the land was not simple, but it was precise. The homeowner, tired of repairing his fence, poured his energy into research. County records, zoning maps, subdivision filings. He combed through every detail. He spent evenings at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, highlighting lines, circling property measurements, and slowly piecing together the overlooked sliver of land that held the key to his plan. In the world of suburban property ownership, details matter more than appearances. Developers, surveyors, and clerks sometimes leave fragments of land tangled in legal limbo. What most residents never notice can become gold to someone willing to look. And that was exactly the case here. The thin strip of land running behind the yards wasn't fully owned by Karen or anyone else. It had been left out of the original subdivision transfer decades earlier, sitting quietly in county records as a purchasable parcel. To Karen, it was just an easy path. To him, it was about to become a weapon. He contacted the county office quietly, almost nervously. The thought that Karen might somehow find out and interfere gnawed at him. But the process was professional, unemotional, and entirely above board. A few signatures, a filing fee, and weeks of bureaucratic waiting stood between him and the title, deed. Each time he mailed another document or confirmed another step, the satisfaction grew. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was playing chess while Karen was still busy kicking over checker pieces. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood carried on with the same surface-level calm. The lawns remained green, the sprinklers ticked rhythmically in the mornings, and the air smelled faintly of barbecue on summer weekends. But beneath that calm, Karen's arrogance only grew louder. She widened her shortcut, trampling flower beds, and leaving muddy tracks after rain. Sometimes she even waved smugly when caught mid-stride, as if daring anyone to confront her. Neighbors whispered about it over coffee and in driveways, but no one dared speak to her directly. They all knew how she reacted when challenged: tantrums, shouting, threats of lawsuits she never followed through with but loved to wield. The homeowner said nothing. Outwardly, he seemed to have given up. His fence, in ruins, looked abandoned. To Karen, it was confirmation that she had won. To him, it was camouflage, hiding the storm quietly brewing behind the paperwork. By midsummer, the final confirmation arrived. The county had approved the sale, and the deed was officially his. The narrow strip of land that Karen had claimed as her shortcut now belonged legally, irrevocably, to the very person she had been tormenting. With a single stroke of a pen, she had lost the path she had fought so brazenly to keep. He didn't act immediately. Timing mattered. He knew that the impact of his plan would come not just from owning the land, but from how and when he revealed that ownership. And so, he waited. He let Karen continue her routine, watching her walk across what was now his property as if she owned it. Each time she did, she unknowingly trespassed. Each step was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. The day he decided to act, he began with careful preparation. He didn't simply repair the old fence, he designed a new one, stronger, taller, strategically placed to box, in the shortcut from every angle. Where before the fence had merely divided yards, this new construction would create an enclosure, a trap of sorts, that left Karen cornered. Once it was up, her shortcut wouldn't just vanish, it would turn into a dead end. He hired professionals to do the work, ensuring it would be built quickly and sturdily. The morning they arrived with lumber, tools, and equipment, the neighborhood buzzed with curiosity. Neighbors peeked through blinds and paused on sidewalks, sensing something significant was unfolding. And Karen, oblivious, assumed it was just another repair job she would eventually tear down. But this was different. The workers didn't just replace panels, they realigned the fence to the exact property lines that now included the newly purchased strip. Bit by bit, the shortcut shrank, its openness closing in until the passage Karen had carved for herself was nothing more than a fenced-in box. For the homeowner, each hammer strike was a note in a symphony of justice. For Karen, the realization came slowly. At first, she didn't notice. She still strutted through the gap during construction, tossing glares at the workers. But by the time the final panels went up and the gates locked into place, her shortcut no longer led to the street. It led only to an enclosed space with no exit. The path she had fought so arrogantly for had transformed into a trap, a pen bordered on all sides by walls she could not legally touch without consequences. The beauty of it was in the legality. Every board was on property the homeowner owned. Outright. Karen couldn't argue. She couldn't scream about rights she never had. The fence wasn't vandalism or retaliation. It was lawful boundary enforcement, protected by the very rules she had mocked. And yet, in her mind, this wasn't justice. It was betrayal. The trap was set, and the neighborhood knew it. Whispers spread quickly. Karen had been fenced in, not metaphorically, but literally. She was now the prisoner of her own arrogance, and she had no idea how to escape without exposing the truth of her trespassing. What began as splintered wood had escalated into a war of paperwork and property lines. And while Karen paced in frustration, staring at the walls that caged her in, the homeowner stood quietly victorious. But the story was not finished. Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat. No, her anger would only fester, growing louder and more destructive. She would lash out, not realizing that every step she took only pulled her deeper into the trap she had walked into herself. The fence was up, the land was his, the shortcut was gone, and Karen's fury was only beginning. When the last plank of the new fence was nailed into place, the quiet suburban neighborhood held its breath. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew what was coming next. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the block, had just discovered that the shortcut she had claimed as her own was gone, walled off by towering boards that blocked her path and sealed her arrogance inside a wooden trap. At first, Karen did not grasp the scale of what had happened. She marched toward her shortcut, with her usual air of entitlement, expecting nothing more than another patch-up job she could break through later. But instead of a narrow opening, she found herself staring at a wall. When she tried to push past, she realized the passage didn't lead anywhere. It was fenced on every side, the panels tall and solid, leaving her stuck in an enclosed box with no exit. The sight alone was enough to ignite her fury. She stormed back into her yard, pacing in circles, her face red with disbelief. To someone like Karen, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult. For years, she had bulldozed her way through rules and property lines, believing no one could stop her. And now, here she was, humiliated in front of her neighbors by a fence that reminded her of what she could not control. Her outrage did not stay private. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with noise. Karen made sure of it. She stormed from house to house, banging on doors, shouting her version of the story. She painted herself as the victim of a cruel prank, insisting that the new fence was harassment, that it was targeted at her, that it was unfair and illegal. She claimed her neighbor had trapped her out of spite, twisting the truth into whatever narrative suited her tantrum. But the neighbors were not as sympathetic as she had hoped. Many of them had endured Karen's antics for years. They had watched her scream at children for riding bikes too close to her lawn, had seen her call the police over parked cars that weren't blocking her driveway, and had heard her late-night shouting matches over imagined slights. To them, this wasn't a cruel trick. It was long overdue justice. They nodded politely while she ranted, but behind closed doors, they whispered about how satisfying it was to finally see her cornered. Karen, of course, could not let the matter rest. She tried to force her way through the fence, tugging at the boards and striking them with whatever she could find. But the panels were sturdy, reinforced and secured by professionals who knew what they were doing. Every attempt she made only left her angrier, her hands splintered, her pride bruised. When brute force failed, she shifted her tactics. She began threatening lawsuits, waving around empty legal jargon as if her words alone could tear down the fence. She called the police, convinced they would take her side. But when officers arrived, they saw a perfectly legal structure built entirely on privately owned land. The paperwork was in order, the property lines indisputable. Karen's complaints held no weight. Each time the police left, she grew more desperate, screaming that the world was against her, that her neighbor was a tyrant, that no one cared about her rights. The more she fought, the deeper she sank. Her anger became entertainment for the BO block. Neighbors watched from porches and windows as she staged her daily outbursts, her voice carrying down the street like a storm siren. Some even recorded her meltdowns, whispering about how quickly the story might go viral if posted online. Karen, who once thrived on control, was now the subject of ridicule, her reputation unraveling with every tantrum. Inside her own home, her fury consumed her. She made phone calls to lawyers, only to be told the same thing. The land was purchased legally, the fence was lawful, and she had no case. She pounded on her desk, slamming phones down, screaming into empty rooms. Every wall of her house echoed with frustration, and yet the one wall that truly mattered, the wooden one outside, stood tall and unmoved. Her rage soon turned outward. She began targeting the homeowner in subtle, petty ways. Trash appeared, scattered near his driveway. Letters went missing from his mailbox. Strange complaints surfaced with the HOA, all traced back to Karen's hand. She was determined to make life miserable for the man who had outsmarted her, even if she couldn't undo what he had done, but each attempt only backfired. The HOA, tired of her endless grievances, grew less responsive. The neighbors, seeing her bitterness firsthand, distanced themselves further. And the homeowner, calm and collected, refused to rise to her bait. It was this calmness that infuriated her most of all. Karen thrived on conflict. She wanted shouting matches, door-slamming confrontations, dramatic exchanges she could twist into tales of victimhood. But instead, she was met with silence. The fence remained, the paperwork held strong, and the man she wanted so badly to defeat went about his life as though she didn't exist. The trap was working, not just physically but psychologically. Karen, who once strutted through her shortcut with pride, now avoided that corner of her yard entirely. She couldn't bear the sight of the towering walls that reminded her of her failure. She told herself she would win eventually, but deep down, a small gnawing doubt had begun to creep in. For the first time in years, Karen had lost. And not just in an argument or a minor squabble. She had lost control of her entire persona. In the neighborhood, the war over the fence had escalated into something larger than either of them had planned. It was no longer about property lines or shortcuts. It was about dominance, about ego, about who held the true power in a community where appearances mattered more than reality. And while Karen raged and flailed, her neighbor quietly stood victorious, the weight of the law and the satisfaction of justice on his side. But Karen was not finished. In her mind, this wasn't the end. It was only a setback. She was already plotting her next move, already scheming for a way to reclaim her throne. As the neighborhood's loudest, most intimidating presence, and as her anger simmered, so too did the storm she was preparing to unleash. The fence had trapped her physically. The law had trapped her legally. But in her own mind, she still believed she could win, and that belief was dangerous. Because, when Karen felt cornered, she didn't back down. She lashed out, and everyone in the neighborhood was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. Karen's rage, once loud and theatrical, began to take on a darker, more calculating tone. Being humiliated in front of the neighborhood was one thing, but living day after day with the fence looming in her backyard was something she could not endure quietly. To her, it wasn't just a wall of wood and nails. It was a monument to her defeat, a constant reminder that someone else had dared to put her in her place. That thought festered in her like a poison, pushing her toward retaliation. First signs of her new campaign were petty, almost childish. Neighbors noticed trash bags mysteriously appearing near the homeowner's driveway, torn open as if raccoons had rummaged through them, though everyone knew whose hands had placed them there. At night, sprinklers were tampered with, spraying water onto cars parked nearby. Mail went missing, packages vanished, and complaints poured into the HOA office, all directed at the man who had quietly outmaneuvered her. Each complaint was outrageous and poorly constructed. Karen accused him of everything from building a fence, too tall, to violating noise ordinances that didn't even apply. She claimed his property was a hazard, that his landscaping was offensive, that his fence was ugly and an eyesore. She filed report after report, clogging the HOA system with grievances so absurd that they became something of a running joke among the board members. But while the HOA laughed behind closed doors, they also grew weary. Karen's behavior was nothing new to them, but this time her obsession was spiraling. What she saw as persistence, they saw as harassment. Her constant phone calls and angry letters consumed hours of their time. Neighbors, too, grew tired of her antics. Conversations on porches and in driveways shifted from amusement to frustration. People avoided her at all costs, dreading the inevitable rant she would unleash if they made eye contact. Karen, blind to the growing resentment, pressed on. She escalated her tactics. On windy days, piles of leaves and debris somehow ended up swept against the fence, conveniently on her neighbor's side. Late at night, the sound of something scraping against wood echoed through the quiet block, only to reveal fresh scratches on the panels by morning. Still, the fence stood firm, an immovable wall that refused to give her the satisfaction of victory. The homeowner, though frustrated by the constant harassment, held steady. His silence infuriated her more than any argument could have. She wanted confrontation. She wanted him to explode, to match her anger with his own so she could play the role of victim once again. But his calm demeanor robbed her of that chance. He filed away her actions quietly, documenting every incident, every petty act of vandalism, every HOA complaint she filed. It was becoming clear to everyone that Karen wasn't just fighting a losing battle, she was unraveling. The stress of being boxed in, both literally by the fence and socially by the neighborhood's cold shoulders, was breaking her. She muttered to herself in her yard, gesturing wildly at the fence as though arguing with it. Sometimes she stood, for long stretches of time, staring at the panels with a look of pure hatred, as if sheer willpower might cause them to collapse. But the fence didn't move. It didn't bend, didn't splinter, didn't yield to her anger. And that infuriated her most of all. By autumn, Karen's retaliation reached its peak. One morning, the neighborhood awoke to find spray paint scrawled across the fence, angry, messy strokes that left no doubt about who was behind them. The graffiti was crude, the words venomous, and yet, the act was as sloppy as it was desperate. The homeowner wasted no time in calling the authorities. With the documentation he had been collecting for months, the vandalism became the final piece of evidence he needed. When police arrived, Karen's attempt to shift blame fell flat. The reports, the photos, the witness accounts, all pointed directly at her. What she thought would intimidate him instead placed her squarely in the crosshairs of legal consequences. She was warned, and not gently. Any further trespassing, vandalism, or harassment would result in charges she could not talk her way out of. The warning shook her, but it did not change her. If anything, it deepened her resentment. She ranted about conspiracies, about neighbors turning against her, about the police siding with the wrong people. She stormed into the next HOA meeting, unleashing a tirade so intense that even the board, long accustomed to her theatrics, cut her microphone and escorted her out. The neighborhood, once silent witnesses to her antics, began to openly mock her. Whispers turned into laughter, laughter into open eye rolls when she appeared. Karen, who had once strutted with the confidence of someone who believed she could never be touched, was now the punchline to every story told over backyard barbecues. Still, she clung to her rage, convinced that she could somehow turn the tide. But the truth was clear to everyone else. She was losing more than a shortcut. She was losing her grip on the neighborhood, her reputation, her influence. And the harder she fought, the more isolated she became. The homeowner, meanwhile, carried on with quiet determination. He fixed the graffiti, reinforced the fence, and continued to live his life. Each repair, each act of resilience, was another silent victory. He knew Karen wasn't finished. She was too stubborn, too prideful to let go. But he also knew that every desperate move she made only tightened the trap around her. Karen believed she was striking back. In reality, she was digging her own grave. And soon, her obsession with revenge would lead her to a breaking point that even she couldn't control. The neighborhood, weary but watchful, braced itself. The storm was far from over, and everyone knew Karen's next move would be bigger, louder, and more destructive than anything she had tried before. Karen had spent months waging her personal war against the fence, and by extension, against the neighbor who built it. But despite her tantrums, her complaints, and her desperate attempts to regain control, the fence remained. It stood tall and unyielding, a constant reminder of the one battle she could not win. And the more it stood, the more Karen began to unravel. Her life, once full of petty victories over neighbors too timid to fight back, was collapsing around her. The HOA, tired of her endless barrage of complaints, had stopped responding to her with anything other than curt, dismissive notices. The neighbors, once silent in their disapproval, now laughed openly when her voice rose across the street. Even the police, summoned again and again by her dramatic calls, treated her with exasperation rather than concern. Everywhere she turned, she was met not with sympathy, but with ridicule. But Karen's pride would not let her surrender. To admit defeat was to admit weakness, and in her world, weakness was unthinkable. Instead, she convinced herself that the only way forward was to escalate further, to deliver a blow so decisive that it would shake her neighbor and the entire neighborhood into remembering who she was. If the fence was the symbol of her humiliation, then destroying it once and for all became her obsession. The plan she devised was reckless and doomed from the start, but to Karen, it felt like the only option. She waited until late at night, when the street was quiet and most of the houses had gone dark. Under the cover of shadows, she crept toward the fence with tools in hand, hammers, crowbars, and whatever else she thought could splinter the wood. She muttered under her breath as she worked, yanking at boards, striking at nails, clawing desperately at the structure that stood between her and the illusion of control she had lost. But this fence was not the flimsy barrier she had smashed. Through months ago, it was reinforced, built with stronger wood, anchored deep into the ground. Each strike she delivered echoed back at her like mockery. Sweat dripped down her face, her hands grew raw, and yet the wall barely budged. The harder she fought, the clearer it became that she was not strong enough to break what had been built to last. In her desperation, she grew careless. Her loud strikes woke neighbors, who peered through blinds and windows at the spectacle unfolding under the moonlight. Whispers spread quickly. Karen was at it again. This time, though, no one intervened. No one called out to stop her. But they simply watched, phones in hand, recording the scene that would soon circulate far beyond their quiet street. By the time the homeowner himself appeared at his window, lights flickering on across the block, Karen was already caught in her frenzy. She screamed at the fence, cursed at the wood, cursed at the man she believed had ruined her life. And then, when she realized she could not break it, she turned her rage toward the yard itself. Plants were trampled, flower beds destroyed, ornaments shattered. In that moment, she wasn't just trying to tear down a fence. She was lashing out at everything, consumed entirely by her anger. But her fury had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The police, called this time not by her but by multiple neighbors, arrived to find her in the act of vandalism. The recordings, the evidence, the months of documented harassment, all of it was laid bare. This was not a case of property dispute anymore. This was criminal destruction, trespassing, and harassment on a scale that could no longer be ignored. Karen's meltdown had reached its breaking point. The police did not treat her with the tolerance she had grown used to. Instead, they treated her as what she had become, a menace to the neighborhood, a woman so blinded by her arrogance that she had crossed lines she could never step back from. The sight of her being escorted away, still shouting and flailing, was one the neighborhood would never forget. For years she had terrorized them with her tantrums and demands, but now, finally, there was a sense of justice. The fence had not only stood firm, it had stood as the evidence that brought her downfall. The homeowner, calm as always, did not gloat. He didn't need to. The neighborhood itself carried the weight of vindication. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had recorded her downfall, and everyone knew that the fence had turned Karen's arrogance into a trap she could not escape. But though Karen had been removed from the immediate scene, her story wasn't over yet. There were still hearings to come, consequences to face, and a neighborhood forever changed by the spectacle of her collapse. And for the homeowner, there was still the matter of what came next, how to ensure that Karen's defeat was not temporary, but final. The fence had done its job. The law had done its job. But Karen was not a woman who went quietly, and her return, whether through legal maneuvering or sheer stubbornness, was still a storm on the horizon. For now, the neighborhood breathed, a sigh of relief. But everyone knew the story was not finished. The night Karen was escorted away marked the end of an era for the neighborhood. For years, her presence had loomed over every cul-de-sac gathering, every HOA meeting, every small dispute that could have been solved with civility. She thrived on chaos, feeding off fear and submission, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that toppled her. The fence, once just a barrier of wood, had become the stage where her downfall played out for all to see. In the days that followed, The neighborhood buzzed with a cautious kind of relief. Conversations at mailboxes no longer revolved around her latest tantrum. Children, once scolded for stepping too close to her lawn, rode their bikes freely again. People walked their dogs without glancing nervously toward her house. The silence that hung over the block wasn't emptiness, it was peace, the kind of peace no one had realized they'd been missing until it returned. But while the neighborhood exhaled, Karen's storm moved into the legal system. The vandalism, the trespassing, the months of harassment, all carefully documented, were laid out against her. The homeowner's meticulous patience in recording every incident turned into an ironclad case, one she couldn't scream or bluff her way out of. For the first time, Karen's reputation worked against her. The judges, the HOA board, even the police officers who had dealt with her countless calls, they all saw a pattern too undeniable to ignore. Her attempts to twist the story into one of victimhood fell flat. She claimed she was trapped, that the fence was harassment, that the land purchase was unfair. But the documents told a different story: lawful ownership, legal construction, and a neighbor who had done everything by the book. Karen had no defense, only excuses, and they crumbled under the weight of facts. The penalties were not small. Fines piled up for vandalism and property damage. Court orders barred her from further harassment. Her influence within the HOA, once wielded like a weapon, was stripped from her entirely. And though she clung to her home with stubborn pride, the financial strain of her actions began to squeeze her. Rumors spread of mounting debt, of late fees and unpaid dues, of a life spiraling out of the control she so desperately craved. For the homeowner, there was no victory parade, no loud celebration. His satisfaction came in the quiet. The fence stood unbroken. The land was his beyond dispute, and his yard, once invaded daily, was his sanctuary again. He went about his life with the steady rhythm he had always wanted, no longer forced to glance toward the gap in the wood, no longer bracing himself for another confrontation. The neighborhood, too, learned from the ordeal. They saw what happened when one person refused to back down, when someone stood up to the chaos instead of letting it spread. In a way, the fence had not only protected one yard, but had restored balance to the entire street. Karen's reign of intimidation was over, and in her absence, the community began to stitch itself back together. Karen's house, once the loudest on the block, grew eerily quiet. Curtains stayed drawn, the yard went unkempt, and the woman who had once made herself impossible to ignore faded into the background. Some said she was too embarrassed to show her face. Others whispered about moving trucks that might arrive any day, taking her away from the place where she had lost everything. Whether she stayed or left, it didn't matter. Her power was gone, her shortcut closed, her pride broken. The irony of it all was not lost on anyone. Karen had destroyed a fence to make life easier for herself, to shave a few seconds off her walk. That single act of arrogance had triggered a chain of events that ended with her losing not just the shortcut, but her standing, her reputation, and her control. She had trapped herself, and no amount of shouting could undo it. For the homeowner, the experience became a story he would carry for the rest of his life, not as a tale of anger, but as a lesson in patience and justice. He had fought not with fists or screams, but with calm persistence, with paperwork and logic. In the end, he hadn't just built a fence, he had built a wall against entitlement, one that stood as a reminder that even the loudest bully could be silenced by the truth. And, for the neighborhood, the story became legend. They told it at gatherings, laughing at the absurdity of it all, shaking their heads at how far Karen had gone, and nodding in respect to the man who had stood firm. Children who grew up there would one day tell newcomers about the woman who tried to take a shortcut and ended up destroying herself in the process. The street, once under Karen's shadow, was free again. The fence remained where it always was, tall and solid, but now it carried a different meaning. It wasn't just a boundary line anymore. It was a victory, a monument to quiet strength, and the final word in a battle that had lasted far too long. Karen had wanted a shortcut. What she got instead was a cage of her own making. And while the neighborhood moved on, she was left with the one thing she could never destroy: the memory of how she lost everything, not because someone took it from her, but because she couldn't stop herself from pushing too far. The story was finished. The fence stood, the neighborhood thrived, and Karen, once the loudest voice on the block, was nothing more than a cautionary tale.